The office was quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight. The CEO sat at the long glass table, skimming through stacks of resumes with a practiced indifference. He had built his empire on discipline, strategy, and an unshakable ability to keep emotions out of business. To him, people were resources, and assistants were easily replaceable. The door opened, and a young woman stepped in. She wasn't dressed in the sleek confidence the corporate world demanded, her suit was modest, her shoes slightly worn. Still, there was something about the way she stood, shoulders back despite the exhaustion in her eyes, that made her presence linger. He asked her routine questions, expecting rehearsed answers. Instead, her voice carried a quiet honesty. She admitted she hadn't worked in firms this large before. She confessed she was still learning how to balance life and work. But beneath the nervousness was a kind of resilience, as if she had weathered storms that most people in this building could never imagine. The CEO studied her carefully, his instinct telling him to dismiss her, to move on to the next polished candidate with years of experience. Yet, something tugged at him, a voice he rarely listened to. For reasons he couldn't explain, he slid her resume aside and said, "You start Monday." The woman's eyes widened in relief, gratitude softening her expression. She thanked him with sincerity that felt disarming. For the first time in years, the CEO felt he had made a decision not from strategy, but from instinct. The first days were clumsy. She wasn't the kind of assistant who impressed with flawless scheduling or sharp corporate polish. She mixed up an appointment, spilled coffee once in the boardroom, and carried an old notebook instead of a sleek tablet. But what she lacked in efficiency, she carried in warmth. The employees, usually tense under the CEO's exacting standards, began to notice the small things she did. She brought homemade cookies on a Monday morning, left handwritten notes that said, "You're doing great," and always remembered to ask how someone's family was doing. Her desk became a quiet corner where people went not for tasks, but for comfort. The CEO watched all this from behind his stern expression. He told himself she was soft, unfit for the harsh pace of his world. Yet he found himself lingering on her presence more than he should. There was something grounding in the way she spoke to people, never hurried, always patient, as if every person mattered. Once, when he barked orders in frustration, she didn't shrink away like others did. Instead, she set a cup of tea beside him and simply said, "You look tired." It unsettled him, the way she saw past the armor he had spent years perfecting. Bit by bit, the office felt lighter, though nothing in the spreadsheets had changed. The CEO began to ask himself questions he hadn't entertained in years. Who was this woman, really? And why did her presence feel less like assistance, and more like healing? It was late, the kind of hour when the building's glass walls reflected only darkness. The CEO stayed behind, buried in reports, when he noticed a faint sound from the break room. Curious, he walked quietly, and there she was, his assistant, humming softly as she packed a small lunchbox. The fluorescent light above flickered, catching the gentleness of her face. She wasn't doing company work, she was preparing something personal, each movement tender, deliberate. He almost turned away, but then his eyes caught the photo tucked beside the lunchbox. His breath froze. It was a boy, smiling widely, maybe 7 or 8 years old. But not just any boy, his boy. The same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, the same stubborn curve of the jaw. Memories rushed back. A love he once abandoned in the pursuit of power, choices made in haste, silence he never broke. She noticed him then, startled, the photo slipping slightly from her hand. For a moment, the room was heavy with unspoken truths. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to explain, yet she didn't need to. He understood. This wasn't just his assistant. She was the mother who had carried the weight he never did, the woman who had raised his child with no demand for help, no bitterness on her face, only quiet strength. The CEO felt something shift inside him. Shock tangled with regret, but above it all rose an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a longing to make right what had been broken. The silence after the discovery lingered like a storm that refused to break. The CEO sat in his office the next day, staring at the city skyline but seeing only the boy's face in the photograph. He had spent years convincing himself that success justified sacrifice, that what he left behind was a chapter better forgotten. But now, confronted with the truth, he realized the cost of his ambition had been far greater than he'd ever admitted. When she entered to deliver some files, her usual calm faltered. She looked at him with guarded eyes, bracing herself for anger, judgment, or worse, dismissal. But none came. Instead, he set the files aside and said softly, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Her hands tightened around the folder, but her voice was steady. "Because I didn't want anything from you." He deserved love, not a transaction. And I could give him that, even if I was alone. Her words pierced him deeper than any boardroom loss ever had. For the first time, he saw her not as an employee, not as someone who had simply survived, but as a woman who had chosen grace over bitterness, sacrifice over resentment. The CEO's chest ached with a feeling long unfamiliar, humility. "I can't change the years I lost," he said, his voice breaking, "but I want to change the ones ahead." It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a promise, born not of power, but of compassion. And for once, the walls around his heart began to crumble. The next morning, the air in the office felt different. The CEO stood before his board of directors, but instead of his usual clipped tone, his voice carried warmth. He introduced her not as his assistant, but as someone who had taught him what true strength looked like. The board exchanged puzzled glances, and used to this softer version of the man they had only known as sharp and relentless. Yet no one questioned him, because the conviction in his words was undeniable. Later that evening, he drove across town with her to a small apartment. The moment the door opened, a boy's laughter filled the room. The child ran straight into her arms, clinging with the fierce love only a son could give. Then, hesitating, his eyes shifted to the man standing awkwardly at the door. The CEO knelt, the weight of pride and years of absence heavy on his shoulders. His voice was quiet, almost trembling as he whispered, "Hi, buddy. I'm your dad, if you'll let me be." For a heartbeat, the boy studied him, as though sensing whether the words were true. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around him. The CEO's chest tightened, tears blurring his vision, as a bond he thought forever lost began to mend. That night wasn't about power or wealth, but about second chances. A family once broken was finding its way back together, not through perfection, but through compassion. And in that fragile, beautiful moment, hope felt more powerful than success.